Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, April 20th, 2020, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. And before we dive in, I want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible this week. Remember, Talk Nerdy is and will always be 100% free to download, and that's because of the support of listeners just like you. This week, I want to call out Michael Gaucher, Christopher Petz, Mary Neva, Pasquale Gelati, Ulrika Hageman, Dudas Infinitas, Brian Holden, Daniel Lang, and David J.E. Smith for your support of the show. If you want to support Talk Nerdy, you've just got to go to patreon.com/talknerdy, or you can visit my website, carasantamaria.com. There you can click through to the Patreon page, and you can also find the Talk Nerdy store. That's also at talknerdymerch.com. And, I think some of the best ways to support the show are to rate and review on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, wherever you listen to podcasts. That really helps me out a lot. All right, guys. So I am super excited about this week's episode because I had the opportunity to sit down with Dr. Philip Goff. He is a philosophy professor at Durham University and a consciousness researcher. And his newest book is called Galileo's Error: Foundations for a New Science of Consciousness. We're going to be talking about something called Panpsychism. Interesting. So guys, without any further ado, here he is, Dr. Philip Goff. Well, Philip, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Cara. It's great to be here. Glad we managed to hook up.
Oh, I know, right? It's been a while that we've been going a little bit back and forth. And then, of course, the world turned upside down. None of us expected that. So I think one of the, I don't know if you could quite call it a benefit, but one of the things that's been happening that I've noticed as a podcaster is that, well, everyone's at home. And so they're ready to record.
Yeah, these crazy times we're living in. Although I was just about to come over to the US actually to do some conferences and stuff, and obviously it's all been cancelled. But that's not the worst, not the worst tragedy of this scenario.
Absolutely not. But
I keep thinking I'm going to wake up and it's all a dream. But
I know, and I feel bad for a lot of authors and scientists who had books scheduled to come out kind of right around now because all of their events have been canceled and they're having to move everything to an online format. Luckily, yours came out a bit ago, right?
Yeah, I was just going to say my colleague, Emily Thomas, who's just got a trade book, just come out on the philosophy of travel, just as the world has these crazy travel restrictions. And so that's a bit of bad luck. But my book came out in last November, I think. Yep. So yeah, it got a chance to have a little bit of publicity before the world shut down. So.
Oh, geez. Yeah. Okay. Well, that's very good, and I think it did benefit us then that we had to push back the interview a few times. So I'm glad to be chatting with you today, and I'm really excited to be talking to you about kind of the concept of your book, Galileo's Error: Foundations for a New Science of Consciousness. This approach has a lot of crossover with the stuff that I've been interested in lately, educationally, even less so with my scientific kind of communication and my journalistic coverage. But I've gone back to school to work on a PhD in clinical psychology, and my emphasis is actually in existential psychotherapy. So there's a lot of philosophy that feeds into this type of psychology. And of course, consciousness, I think, is a really important conversation to be had. That said, I wonder how different our views are about consciousness. So I'm very excited to dig into what you think.
I don't know what is existential. I don't know. Well, maybe this is not the time to talk about it. Maybe, but I don't. It sounds interesting.
It's really interesting. It's basically just a therapeutic intervention or a therapeutic idea. I guess you could say it's a whole kind of theory that's informed by existential views. So instead of taking a more psychoanalytic or a more cognitive behavioral approach to psychotherapy, you take a approach that's all about kind of deeper things like meaning, authenticity, and then there are some views about fears of death and loneliness and finding meaning that a lot of existential therapists think underlie why people might seek therapy.
Right. Does that have any connection to what's his name now? Viktor Frankl, logotherapy.
Absolutely. He
Yeah.
was definitely one of the kind of, in some ways, what people think of as a founder. And it's interesting because when it comes to existentialism, and I think the reason that I bring this up is because there's some parallels with what we're going to be talking about, panpsychism. When it comes to existentialism, there are two. Well, there are a lot of ways you could slice and dice it, but there are two big camps that seem to play nice together. And one is a very secular camp, and that's the camp I'm in, which is kind of a Irvin Yalom camp that it takes things from a more atheistic approach. And then, of course, there is a more religious camp where you might see like a Kierkegaard or you might see like a Viktor Frankl. But it's kind of two sides of the same conversation. One of the differences is there is inherent meaning in the world and it's our job to uncover it. And then my view is that there is no meaning in the world and it's our job to create it.
A bit of trivia. There's my UK publisher is the same publisher that Viktor Frankl had back in the day.
Oh, wow.
Right.
Oh, man,
But
that's cool.
yeah, no, I mean, this is not my area of expertise, but I have an interest in psychotherapy, and I think it's been in the back of my head actually somehow that is there sort of a lack of thinking about the meaning of life and finding meaning in existence, and so that's that. I find that really interesting. I'll investigate further.
I love it. I mean, I've always kind of felt like there's a lot of crossover between psychology and philosophy because, you know, some would argue, I guess I'm interested in your take on this. My background is neuroscience, and, I was kind of trained as a much more kind of logical positivist originally, much more of a materialist. That's in some ways been changing as I learn more about constructivism and postmodern views, and I'm trying to figure out how to square all those circles together. But philosophy and modern science, natural science, in many ways have long been attempting to answer some of the same fundamental questions, haven't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And well, I mean, we might get onto this. I mean, I do think our scientific story of the world does have implications, perhaps, for people's sense of their place in the world and, people's mental health ultimately. I mean, so, I'm inclined to believe, I'm inclined to think our standard scientific worldview does not have a place for consciousness. And I think that in itself can lead to a sense of alienation. I think many of us, we know we have feelings and experiences, and our official scientific worldview tells us, no, all that's going on in our heads are sort of complicated electrochemical signaling. And I think many people feel intuitively that's not the same thing. And I think this can lead to this disenchantment of nature, this sense that we don't have a place in the universe. And, I think I talk a little bit about this, in the final chapter of my book. I mean, ultimately, when we're doing science or philosophy, we should be interested in not which view we'd like to be true, but which view is most likely to be true. And I make a case for panpsychism, which we'll probably get onto, as the probable truth of panpsychism on the basis that I think it offers the best scientific approach to consciousness. But I also think it's maybe a picture of the world that's slightly more consonant with our mental and spiritual well-being. It's a picture of the universe when we can sort of understand our place within it a bit more, understand how we fit into it. So, yeah, I mean, I'm in some way a hard-nosed scientist philosopher. We should be looking for the truth. That's the fundamental thing. But I think we don't do enough of reflecting on how scientific theory and scientific worldview impacts on how we see ourselves fitting into the universe. And I think that is important.
Ugh, I couldn't agree more. I think that the more that I kind of learn about realistic sort of constructivist and postmodern views, and I'm not talking about really, really extreme versions, kind of like solipsistic views, but more kind of middle of the road ideas in this kind of vein, the more I start to really, I think, in many ways, um, support, I don't know, endorse this idea that, of course, the world is, or the universe is, or nature is, right? And the question becomes, if we are the ones who are contemplating it, filtering it through our tools and our consciousness, at a certain point, does what is matter if what is only itself through our own eyes? And that becomes a really interesting question, like this kind of idea of existence as something that is a concrete thing that cannot be accessed, or the idea of how do we determine it through our own tools, right? And philosophy, natural science, these are tools. These are just um, methods and descriptions that make sense to us as human beings. Like our perspective is obviously very different than the perspective of, let's say, an alien from many galaxies away.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I mean, but I think there are multiple things philosophy has a role to play. I think, yeah, part of it is reconciling our understanding of ourselves with the understanding of the universe that science gives to us. But I also think, that there are ways, and this is maybe it's a bit neglected, there are ways in which philosophy can contribute to our understanding of what the universe is like. Certainly with respect to consciousness, I think, at the moment, we know that consciousness exists. We know that nothing is more obvious or evident than the reality of feelings or experiences. But at this stage, we really have no clue as to how to fit consciousness into our scientific story of the universe. Despite great progress on our scientific understanding of the brain, we still don't have even the beginnings of an explanation of how complicated electrochemical signaling is somehow able to give rise to this inner subjective world of colors and sounds and smells and tastes that each of us knows in our own case. So, I think there is a real philosophical puzzle there, and how what we know about ourselves from the inside fits together with what science tells us about the body and the brain from the outside. And some people think this is just, we just need to do more neuroscience. We just need to carry on with our conventional ways of investigating the brain, and we'll one day solve this mystery. But what I try to press in my work is as a philosopher is I think this isn't just another scientific problem. There are many ways in which this is quite unique, and that there are features of it that mean that our conventional scientific approach isn't really suited to dealing with it, and in fact wasn't really designed to deal with it. So that doesn't mean we will never have a science of consciousness, but it means if we want a science of consciousness, we might need to rethink what science is. So, yeah.
Hmm. So I would love to ask you kind of some basic questions about consciousness as I have understood it throughout my academic career, going from psychology. So my undergrad was psychology and philosophy. My master's was neuroscience, and now I'm moving into clinical psychology in my PhD much, years and years and years later after being out of school for a long time. So kind of let's see, I did my master's degree in '07. So my kind of neuroscience expertise, not that it stopped there. I've been keeping up with the literature as a science communicator, but that was the era when I was doing neuroscience, and I was working in a kind of network neuroscience. And so where I kind of have always understood consciousness to, I'll use the word arise because that's sort of the right word for my framework, has always been as a property that sort of exists, yes, secondary to neuroscience, but as something that's a little bit gestalt, in that you can't break it down to individual neurons. You can't break it down to individual networks, to neurochemistry. It's an emergent property, as some scientists might say. Is that a view that you take, or is that a view that you kind of fundamentally disagree with?
Um, yes, I suppose it depends what you mean by emergent, really.
Hmm.
There's sometimes it's sort of emergent is a sort of magic word for it appears and we don't really know how, or is it the miracle happens and then it appears?
Yeah.
But emergent can mean lots of different things. For example, some scientists often talk about liquidity or water being the wetness of water being an emergent property, just in the sense that, individual molecules are not wet, but when you put them together, you get wetness. But there's nothing sort of mysterious about that. There's nothing in principle inexplicable. We understand quite well the chemistry of how you produce the superficial properties of water. But I think something very different is going on in the case of consciousness. It's a complete mystery how the kind of things we study in neuroscience, things, action potentials and calcium chambers and, various kinds of neurotransmitter and, all that wonderful stuff. I mean, I'm not a neuroscientist, but I'm absolutely fascinated by neuroscience and collaborate with my colleagues and try to stay as up to date as possible. But all of that story of the brain doesn't seem to mention feelings and experiences. It seems on the face of it that whole story of in processing information and behavioral functioning and electrochemical signaling could go on in the complete absence of experience. And so we're left with this mystery of how what we know about ourselves from the inside, our feelings and experiences, fits together with the neuroscientific story of the brain. So, and some people think, well, this is we just need to carry on with our standard ways of investigating the brain, and we'll crack it. But I mean, there are various ways in which this is a really different kind of problem. One thing, one way I like to press is just that consciousness is not publicly observable, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, our whole scientific method is based around observation. And I think when we generally talk about observation, we mean what's publicly observable.
There's kind of consensus required.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, what you can test in a third person way, what you can experimentally test and we can all agree on. But the problem with consciousness is it's essentially private, right? Only you can observe your own experiences in some sense. I can see the external markers of your sadness or your joy, your tears or your smile, but I can't look inside your head and see your happiness and your sadness. Now science is used to dealing with unobservables, right? Fundamental particles, for example, can't be directly observed. But
true.
In all of these other cases, we postulate unobservables in order to explain what can be observed. Particles, electrons and quarks are postulated as part of the standard model of particle physics that explains so much that we can observe. But I think in the unique case of consciousness, the thing we are trying to explain is not publicly observable. And so I think this really constrains how we can deal with it experimentally. So, we obviously do deal with it experimentally, what neuroscientists, because it's not publicly observable, the only way you can gather data about consciousness is by asking people, right, about their private observations of their own feelings and experiences. And if you do that while you scan people's brains with an fMRI scanner, you can map correlations, right? You can discover various ways in which various kinds of brain activity is correlated with various kinds of feelings and experiences. You can discover a certain kind of activity in the hypothalamus or something is correlated with feeling hungry or something. So I think that's the limits of what we can do experimentally because consciousness is not publicly observable. But unfortunately, important as that data is, I don't think it's the full story, because what we ultimately want from a theory of consciousness is an explanation of those correlations. Why are certain kinds of brain activity correlated with feelings and experiences? Why would that be? And I don't think just doing more neuroscience, just gathering more correlations is going to do that. So I think so that's why one way of seeing why this isn't a problem we're just going to solve experimentally. We need to sort of, because consciousness is not a publicly observable phenomenon. So yeah.
So that raises kind of two questions for me. The first one that comes up, which is maybe the most striking, is what do you say to kind of some scientific thinkers who would respond to that by saying, we don't care why. Sometimes we're never going to know why. All we care is that it is.
Yeah. Well, it depends what you mean by what. I mean, I'm not asking why in a sort of existentialist, going back to that sense, why
Hmm.
are we here? What's the meaning of life? There's an interesting article by a scientist I recently saying, oh, these people worried about the problem of consciousness. It's just they're thinking of why in in this existential sense of why are we here? What's it all about? But that's not the question that's being asked here at all. It's, it's in science, we want explanations, right? We want to know, water boils at 100 degrees. Why is that the case? And we
Hmm.
explain it. We have chemical theories that explain quite nicely the superficial properties of water. Lightning, we see lightning in the sky, this flashing thing, and we want an explanation of that. And science comes along and gives us some theories of electrostatic discharge that explain that. Similarly, when there are certain types of thing happen in my brain, I feel pleasure or pain or I see red. We want an explanation of that. So it's not why in some deeply kind of meaning of life sense. It's just the standard scientific demand for explanation. It's just that the phenomenon we're dealing with here is a very unusual phenomenon, and hence I think the standard experimental methods of science don't quite, important as they are, don't quite give us the full explanation. I mean, you could still say, I don't care. You have a similar issue in quantum mechanics, I think, where
Hmm.
quantum mechanics is one of our most successful scientific theories. It's almost all of our modern technology is based on quantum mechanics. In terms of prediction, it's one of our most successful scientific theories. The problem is no one knows what the hell that theory is telling us about reality. And there are all these
True.
different theories, and some scientists respond to that and say, "Well, who cares? It works." This is sometimes
Hmm.
called the "shut up and calculate" approach. And the scientist Sean Carroll's been talking a lot on his podcast about how it's been taboo for a long time to kind of worry about this. People couldn't get jobs because they wanted to know what is going on. What is quantum mechanics telling us about reality? But I think just because, I think the natural human curiosity, science isn't just about building bridges and curing disease and creating technology. It's about understanding the universe we live in, understanding the reality that underlies our equations. And that's what people want in quantum mechanics. A lot of people increasingly want. And I think that's what we want with consciousness. Yes, the neuroscience is crucial. Those correlations that neuroscience gives us between brain activity and experience, and neuroscience can get very systematic about that. It's not just saying this brain state goes with this experience, but ultimately, what we at the end of the day, I think what we want to know is what's going on in reality. Why is it that brain activity gives rise to kinds of experience? And and as I said, for the reason I said, I don't think that's a question that experimental neuroscience can answer.
Interesting. So the other question that kind of came up through those explanations, for me, and this is a more kind of from a neuroscience perspective, is what do you say to, or have you been able to read some of the literature and grappled with the types of experiments that are much more interested in thresholds of consciousness? So, really looking at the difference between somebody who is conscious and somebody who has a loss of consciousness and what is going on um, neuroscientifically, whether we're talking about holistically in the brain or whether we're starting to become a little bit more sort of fundamentalist and break it down into different regions or break it down into individual networks or even individual cells. When people slip into unconsciousness, different levels of coma and things like that, it does seem like we're learning more and more about what is maybe minimally required biologically to maintain what we think of as consciousness.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's I'm absolutely fascinated by how much progress we've made here. I mean, some of the things we can do with binocular rivalry and with various forms of masking, where we sort of, I mean, the more colloquial term for that is subliminal images, right? Where we where
Mm-hmm.
we slip in an image of something so quickly that people don't consciously register it. It doesn't come into their conscious awareness. But we can see through asking various questions that their brain has processed that information, and it's gone quite detailed into the cortex, that the processing that's gone on. And what we've discovered, actually, I've been fascinated by, is that even semantic information, judgments of the meaning of words, can go on subconsciously in these masking cases. We can see this because, I can't think offhand now the specific examples, but we have a sort of subliminal image of a particular word, and then by asking, even though the subject doesn't consciously perceive it, it's not in their conscious awareness, we can see that their brain has processed the information about what that word means because of
Mm-hmm.
because of the certain answers they give, the associations that come to mind for them. So it's absolutely fascinating. This is an age-old philosophical question, actually. Do you need uh, consciousness for understanding the meanings of words? You might have thought as a philosopher that you did, but we can now show experimentally that that you don't. This can, semantic processing of the meanings of words goes on to a large extent subconsciously as well as consciously. So this is all very important data. You're not going to have a science of consciousness without it. And as you say, we're making progress on theorizing about the very general conditions for what is required for consciousness. I mean, one popular theory, the global workspace theory, which is roughly that what you are conscious of is a matter of the kinds of information that's broadcast throughout much of the brain and is available for many different regions of the brain for controlling behavior. Daniel Dennett called this fame in the brain, or cerebral celebrity. And a rival view is, the integrated information theory, according to which it's integrated information that's the hallmark of consciousness. And one of the reasons people have got interested in panpsychism is because actually this theory entails, although it has some empirical confirmation in the sense that it can explain which regions of the brain are associated with consciousness and which aren't, which periods of sleep are associated with consciousness and which aren't, but it also has panpsychist implications, at least to the extent that it entails that consciousness is more widespread than we ordinarily take it to be, because some degree of integrated information is present in many non-organic physical systems, although there's disputes about how much empirical support the integrated information theory has. But in any case, this is all very important, but at the end of the day, I don't think this kind of work can get us beyond correlations. And the reason is because, on the one hand, you're dealing with two things that are known about in different ways. Consciousness that's, as it were, only privately observable. Only the person having the experience can be directly aware of it, and the brain that's publicly observable. So what we're doing when we're trying to what's sometimes called the neural correlates of consciousness, trying to find out what needs to go on in a brain to get consciousness, we're trying to correlate what we can observe publicly, i.e. brain activity, with what we can't observe publicly, people's private feelings and experiences. So
Yeah.
by relying on their testimony, we can correlate them up, but that in itself won't give us an explanation of why they're correlated. So that's, I think, where we have to step beyond the experimental neuroscience.
So I guess probably now would be a good time. Maybe I should have done it a bit earlier to
Okay.
ask you. Perhaps you can just give us a little bit of a global overview of exactly what panpsychism is and what it kind of seeks to, like, what kind of explanatory power it seems to have for you.
Yeah. So So I guess in our standard way of thinking about things, consciousness exists only in the brains. Actually, could I say one more thing about the science stuff?
Please, yes.
One thing I'm trying to press in my own work, which is the reason for the title of my book, Galileo's Error, is that we shouldn't be surprised that our conventional scientific approach struggles to deal with consciousness. And that's because our standard scientific approach was designed to exclude consciousness. So a key
Mm.
moment in the scientific revolution was Galileo's declaration that mathematics is to be the language of the new science, that the new science is to have a purely quantitative vocabulary. But Galileo understood quite well that you can't capture consciousness in these terms because consciousness is a qualitative phenomenon, just in the sense that it involves qualities. If you think about the redness of a red experience, or the smell of coffee, or the taste of mint, you can't capture these kind of qualities in the purely quantitative language of physical science, right? You can't capture it in an equation, the itchiness of an itch or the cold feel of ice. So Galileo said, right, back in 1623, right, if we want a purely mathematical quantitative science, we have to take these qualities of consciousness and put them in the soul, right, outside of the domain of science. So in
Hmm.
Galileo's worldview, you've got this radical divide in nature between two domains, the the quantitative domain of science and the qualitative domain of consciousness. So you've got on the one hand, the physical world with its purely quantitative mathematical properties, and on the other hand, consciousness with its qualities of sounds and smells and colors and tastes. So this was the start of mathematical physics, which has gone incredibly well. But I think what we've forgotten is that physics was never intended to be a complete description of reality. The whole project was premised on putting consciousness outside of the domain of science. So I think if we now want a science of consciousness, we need to find a way of bringing it back in, of bringing together these two domains, the quantitative domain of physical science and the qualitative reality of consciousness. And I think, panpsychism, the attraction of it is it gives us a way of trying to do that.
And so I guess the thing that when I sort of have tried to wrap my head around panpsychism, that sticks out to me as something that makes it hard to square with my own basic, I don't know, personal understanding of reality is sort of the, I don't know if this is the right word to use, but religious or maybe spiritual is a better word to use, implications of it. And as an atheist or somebody who's like purely secular, that part doesn't sit as well for me. But then again, maybe I'm misunderstanding panpsychism at its fundamental level. So I was hoping maybe you could help us, me and the listeners, understand a little bit more about what I guess the theory, would you call it a theory, or the philosophy says?
Yeah. So I mean, I guess in our standard way of thinking about things, consciousness exists only in the brains of highly evolved organisms. And so consciousness exists only in a tiny part of the universe, and only in very recent history, in terms of the history of the universe at least. But according to panpsychism, consciousness pervades the universe and is a fundamental feature of it. So it doesn't literally mean that everything is conscious. That's one common misunderstanding. The
Mhm.
basic commitment is that the fundamental building blocks of the physical world, perhaps electrons and quarks, have unimaginably simple forms of experience, and the very complex experience of the human or animal brain is somehow derived or built up from the very simple experience of the brain's most basic parts. So, yeah, it sounds a bit wacky. As you say, it has these unfortunate sort of new age spiritual kind of connotations. But, I mean, this view's gone from being laughed at insofar as it was thought of at all, to being taken very seriously, certainly in academic philosophy and in some parts of neuroscience. Um, and the people who are defending it, myself, David Chalmers and very good panpsychist philosopher Luke Roelofs, these people are complete atheists, secularists, right? They're not interested in trying to defend some kind of transcendent spiritual reality. They're just interested in explaining the natural phenomenon of consciousness, feelings and experiences. Whether or not you believe in God or some kind of spiritual reality, most of us believe in pain and pleasure and, visual, auditory experiences. And the problem is those very, in a sense, mundane phenomena. People think consciousness is mysterious. In a sense, it's really mundane. It's just, pain, seeing red. It's the most obvious everyday thing. I guess it's so obvious we sort of forget about it because it's just there all the time. But it's such a challenge scientifically and philosophically to fit that into our standard scientific story of the world. And as I've said, I don't think our conventional scientific approach was designed to accommodate conscious experience. So it's not about trying to justify something spiritual. It's just about trying to accommodate this undeniable phenomena of conscious subjective experience.
Do you feel like there's a lot of crossover with this idea of panpsychism and some more kind of Eastern philosophies like Taoism?
I'd say so. Maybe in one direction, yeah. I suppose. If you independently have some kind of spiritual convictions, then probably panpsychism is perhaps a worldview that's more consonant with that picture of the world, and as I said, it's maybe a picture of the world that's slightly more consonant with human happiness. Materialism is kind of bleak in a way. It's sort of like a mechanistic picture of nature and the cold immensity of empty space, whereas panpsychism was sort of conscious creatures in a conscious universe. So, but I think at the end of the day, the kind of panpsychism that's being defended is stripped of any of these kind of spiritual or mystical connotations. It's simply an attempt to try and bring together, as I said, what we know to be true from the inside, feelings and experiences, and what science is telling us from the outside. It's simply a way of integrating consciousness into our scientific picture of the world. So, yeah.
So kind of like, I feel like in some respects, probably because of the types of questions that I've been asking you, we're almost talking around panpsychism instead of getting to the meat of like what exactly the philosophy says. So when you said kind of this idea of conscious creatures in a conscious universe, like what does that actually mean? Like how would you define the central tenets?
Yeah, so I think the place we need to start really is, and well, I'd just say one of the reasons for the rediscovery of panpsychism in academic philosophy is due to the rediscovery of certain important work from the 1920s by the philosopher Bertrand Russell and the scientist Arthur Eddington, who was incidentally the first scientist to confirm Einstein's general theory of relativity experimentally after the First World War. But so I'm inclined to think these guys did in the 1920s for the science of consciousness what Darwin did in the 19th century for the science of life. And it's sort of a tragedy of history that it got forgotten about for so long, but it's recently been rediscovered and is causing a lot of interest in academic philosophy. And part of the reason I wrote this book was to try and get that out to a broader audience. But anyway, I'm still talking around it, so let me cut to the heart of it. So the starting point of Russell and Eddington was that physical science doesn't really tell us what matter is. And that seems like a kind of really bizarre claim at first. You read a physics textbook, you seem to learn all these incredible things about the nature of space and time and matter. But what Russell and Eddington realized is that physics, for all its richness, is confined to telling us about the behavior of matter, what it does. So, physics tells us, for example, that matter has mass and charge. Think of what does physics tell us about an electron? Physics tells us an electron has mass and charge. And these properties are completely defined in terms of behavior. things like attraction, repulsion, resistance to acceleration. This is all about the behavior of the electron. Physics tells us what an electron does, but it doesn't tell us anything about what it is independently of its behavior. So, I sometimes make an analogy to a chess piece. If you've got a chess piece on a board, you might want to know, what it does. If it's a bishop, it moves diagonally any number of spaces. But you might also be interested in the chess piece itself. Is it made of wood? Is it made of plastic? Is it made of metal? Similarly, when we get down to fundamental particles like electrons, you might be interested in what physics tells you about how the electron behaves, what it does. But you might also be interested in the electron itself. What is an electron independently of what it does? So this is their starting point. There's this huge hole in our standard scientific story of the universe. Physics tells us what matter does, but not what it is. And then the proposal of Russell and Eddington was to put consciousness in that hole. So there's, we're looking for a place for consciousness. There's this huge hole in our scientific story of the universe. Let's try and put consciousness in the hole. So the thought is there's just matter, maybe particles or fields, nothing spiritual or supernatural, but matter can be described from two perspectives. So physics describes it, as it were, from the outside in terms of what it does, its behavior, but matter from the inside is made up of consciousness. So it's this beautiful, simple, elegant way of bringing together what we know about ourselves from the inside, the reality of feelings and experiences, and what science tells us about matter from the outside. So that's really the attraction of the view. I like to put it, in the 1620s, Galileo took consciousness out of the scientific story. In the 1920s, I think Russell and Eddington found a way of bringing it back in again, of bringing together this qualitative and quantitative domains. Anyway, sorry to interrupt you.
Not at all. I mean, I guess my original response to that, and it's likely an ignorant response just based on the kind of brief explanation that you gave me, is I guess I'm interested in how this is different than talking about emergence, in that it still feels like there's kind of a miracle component to the explanation. Like, oh, it's the intrinsic or the intersubjective, or it's, kind of what's happening in an electron from the inside, but we don't know anything about that. It's still just a black box, no?
Yeah, so I think what's wrong with the standard materialist, as you say, emergentist approach, in my view, is that it has to try and bridge this gap between the purely quantitative properties of neuroscience, physical science, and the qualitative reality of consciousness. You have to try and get from this purely quantitative story of what's going on in the brain to the qualitative reality of seeing blue and smelling coffee and so on. And no one's made the slightest progress on bridging that gap. And I think there are good philosophical reasons to think the attempt to do that is incoherent. I mean, we could go into that. But so that's what you're trying to do in the standard approach. You're trying to bridge a gap, which I think is unbridgeable. What we're trying to do in the panpsychist approach, we're not trying to bridge a gap. We're putting consciousness in from the start. So the idea is, there's just really, on this view, all there is consciousness. So it's important to emphasize that this isn't dualism. This isn't, when people hear about panpsychism, they tend to think, well, the electron has its physical properties like mass, spin, and charge, and then it has these consciousness properties as well. That would be a kind of dualism. The physicist Sabine Hossenfelder has written a critique of panpsychism on her blog recently, but she was assuming this kind of dualistic position of panpsychism. But that's not.
And to be clear, to be clear, dualism is this kind of classic philosophy, as opposed to monism, that there's the self or the soul or the mind. I guess mind is the best way to put it. That the mind and the brain are two completely distinct things that can kind of interact or have power over one another, as opposed to a monist perspective, which is that they're kind of two sides of the same coin. Like, they're so interwoven that for all intents and purposes, they can't be, they're inextricably linked, I guess is a way to put it.
Yeah,
Is
sorry.
that your view?
Yeah, absolutely. I should have
Okay.
explained that. So
No,
yes,
not at all.
the ancient view that consciousness is in the soul, that this is
Mhm.
outside of the physical workings of the body and the brain. Um, but similarly, you might have a kind of understanding of panpsychism where, okay, it's not belief in the soul, but you believe in the physical properties of the electron, like mass, spin, and charge, and also these consciousness properties. So there's two kinds of radically different properties. You've got the divide again. But that's not the view. The view is that mass, spin, and charge are forms of consciousness. So
Hmm.
science tells us what they do, but what they are forms of consciousness. So at the basic micro level, we've got simple forms of consciousness. At the level of neurophysiology of the human brain, we've got complex forms of consciousness. But there's just consciousness there from the start. So you're not trying to bridge a gap. Now, you might still make the criticism that you earlier made. You might say, well, you're not explaining anything, if you're just assuming it, right? But, science, there is plenty of precedent in science for non-reductive explanations. That is to say, explanations where you take the phenomenon as basic. So, for example, in the 19th century, when Maxwell came up with his theory of electromagnetism, he didn't explain electricity and magnetism in terms of the kind of mechanical properties science was already committed to. He postulated new electromagnetic properties and laws and explained electromagnetism on that basis. Similarly, for the panpsychist, it's early days in the science of consciousness, but the final theory of consciousness, when it eventually comes along, it won't explain consciousness in terms of non-consciousness. It will postulate very basic forms of consciousness and explain human consciousness in terms of those simpler forms of consciousness. So it's just a different kind of explanatory project. Yeah.
And so I'm so interested kind of what I've always loved philosophy, and I've always loved reading about different historical kind of stories that philosophers told about how to um, explain or perceive or reframe our understandings of reality. And I'm so interested in kind of like, I don't know what it entails, what it's like. I guess I'm not even sure how to frame this question, but as a working academic philosopher, like, what do you do every day? And like, what is the experience like for you?
I think we've sort of lost touch with what philosophy is all about, and I think in many ways we've forgotten that there is a philosophy behind science, and it was designed 400 years ago by Galileo, and it has certain philosophical components that aren't justified by experiment or observation. So before Galileo, people thought the physical world was filled with qualities. That there were colors on the surfaces of objects, smells floating through the air, tastes inside food. That was the philosophical worldview following Aristotle. But Galileo wanted this mathematical, quantitative theory of nature, and he thought, we need to get rid of these qualities, these colors and sounds and smells and tastes. So he said, I'm going to propose a new philosophy of nature. And then according to this philosophy of nature, those qualities, colors, sounds, smells, they're not really out there in the physical world. They're just in the soul. So, colors, if you're looking at a tomato, the redness isn't really out there on the surface of the tomato for Galileo. It's in the consciousness of the person perceiving the tomato, or the spiciness isn't really in the paprika. It's in the consciousness of the person eating it.
And that kind of explains intersubjectivity. It explains why it
Yeah.
is that your experience of a tomato is fresh and delicious and mine is gag worthy. Like
Yeah, well, it's fascinating actually. That's another fascinating finding of neuroscience. How we've discovered that, more generally of neurophysiology,
mm.
how people's tomato, is so sensitive to actual physiological differences. So I think people who don't
Mm.
like tomatoes are people look down on them a little bit, think they're not cultured or something, but it can actually be simply due to physiological differences. But yeah, so Galileo, stripped the world of these qualities so that we could have a mathematical picture of nature. And so, you can't get rid of philosophy. I mean, we tried to in the 1930s and 40s with logical positivism, the view that, if a sentence, so the logical positivists thought if a sentence can't be empirically verified or falsified, then it was just meaningless. It was just gibberish. So they hoped in this way to dissolve philosophy and just get us down to questions that we can answer with empirical science. Unfortunately, the view is now universally rejected by philosophers of science, not least because people realized it's self-defeating, right? Because I remember learning this when I was doing philosophy at high school, and I was just absolutely fascinated. The point is that, so the principle of the logical positivists was at what I've just said, right? If a sentence can't be verified, then it's meaningless. But that principle itself can't be verified. And so if it's true, it's meaningless. So, people just realize that, that's part of the role of philosophy, that, analytic rigor of philosophy, to see that actually this view was just self-defeating, incoherent in a sense. So actually, the philosophers of science have universally rejected positivism, but you do find it still comes up. People still have this, even though we've rejected it decades ago, people still have this sort of scientistic view that we can get all the answers from empirical science.
And I see it all the time in the world that I exist in because, other than my academic pursuits, I have been working as a science communicator for the past decade plus. And one of the podcasts that I work on is The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe. I'm heavily kind of involved in skeptic communities. And one of, I think, the biggest kind of fallacies that I find within the skeptic community is a heavy reliance on logical positivism without any room for what my counter to that I see is a more constructivist or a more postmodern view, like figuring out how those things play nicely together. I actually just did a big talk on it when the last time I did a little bit of a tour down in Australia and New Zealand, called Is Constructivism a 4-letter word? Simply because I wanted to bring this idea to a lot of the skeptics in the room that saying if science can't touch it, or if we can't view it experimentally, if we can't show some sort of understanding utilizing this method, that it's not relevant, basically means that you're closing your eyes to the vast majority of experience. There's got to be other epistemologies out there for us to try and understand existence, because science only, by the way that it was designed, can handle natural phenomena that are observable and I guess changeable. You've got to be able to manipulate variables in an effort to be able to say anything about something scientifically.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're of one mind on this. Skeptics are very important for debunking questions that are empirical questions, like, are there ghosts? How old is the universe? These are empirical questions.
Yeah.
And
really
important. We want empirical scientists to, subject them to, not have people saying bullshit, but that's not empirically backed up. But not all questions are empirical questions. And this is the most straightforward thing that I try to press. Coming back to where we started, I think our standard approach to science is, what we're trying to do is find the simplest theory consistent with what we can publicly observe, what we can subject to public observation, experimental testing. If you stick rigorously to that methodology, you will not believe in consciousness, because consciousness is not something that can be publicly observed. We believe it on the basis of our immediate awareness of our feelings and experiences. So Daniel Dennett, the philosopher, is wonderfully consistent on this, right? So, he's the polar opposite position on consciousness to me. He thinks consciousness can't be observed from the third person, so it doesn't exist. He thinks he goes back and forth over whether you literally say, he thinks consciousness exists in some sense, doesn't in others. But what he does think is the only data for a theory of consciousness is publicly observable behavior. That's it.
Mm.
Once we've explained the publicly observable behavior, that's the end of the theory. Okay, I think there's something else we need to explain. Feelings and experiences. Where do they come from? Why do they exist? We know they're real, but they're not publicly observable. So I think consciousness is the most obvious case where we do need to rethink how we're thinking about science. I mean, I kind of think we're going through a phase of history where people are so blown away by the success of physical science and the wonderful technology it's produced that this creates in people a sense of, this is it, this is the truth, we know the truth now. We don't have all the answers, but we know how to get them. But I think once you trace back physical science to, if you ask Galileo about this, if you were to talk to Galileo about this problem of explaining consciousness in the terms of physical science, he'd say, of course you can't do that. I designed physical science for a very specific, narrow task. And it wasn't the task of accounting for the qualitative, unobservable reality of consciousness. So, and I think it's hard to shift people on this because I think it does get involved in people's identity and sense of themselves. And, people talk about religion as a crutch, but I think a certain kind of scientistic worldview can give people a sense of, how they understand truth and the world. And so that's what's most important to me, really, is even more important than panpsychism is the problem of consciousness is not just another scientific problem. And I just try to hammer that home. And the way I've found most powerful for doing that is just to keep hammering home the point that it's not publicly observable. And I haven't found yet a good answer to that, apart from Daniel Dennett's, which is to say, so it doesn't exist. But I don't think many people will go for that, pretty radical
Or I guess
line.
the alternate is that kind of like, as we were saying before, maybe it exists, maybe it doesn't, but the fact that we can't interrogate it means that it's not really relevant to our worldview. Like that's kind of a very materialistic,
right.
Logical positivist view, which again, I mean, I guess I get it. I mean, it's a clean way for some people to be able to make sense of reality and maintain a very consistent worldview. I just think it's, sadly, I think it's a bit impoverished. I think it's like there's so much beauty and so much profundity that viewing the world in that way is very lacking. It's an intellectually, I guess, honest way to live your life, but it's very narrow. And I don't know, it kind of bums me out. I just can't physically, I can't exist in that kind of very strict pair of glasses, because if I do so, I just continue to have questions about things.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is important. I think, consciousness is at the root of human identity. And, it's fundamentally we relate to each other as conscious beings with feelings and experiences. It's arguably the basis of everything that's important in human existence. And so I think it is a problem, I suspect, if our official scientific worldview doesn't have a place for consciousness, which I think it doesn't, controversially. I think that can maybe have an effect even on people's mental health. I think there's a lot of crazy shit going on in the world at the moment. I mean, I think there are a lot of economic and political explanations for that, but I'm not talking about the coronavirus, by the way. But I think some of what's going on wrong with the world at the moment, I think a little bit of it might be a sense of alienation, a sense of not understanding how we fit into the universe. I wonder how much the attraction of nationalism or fascism is that it tells you a story of how you fit into the world. And I think one small part of that is the fact that we don't understand how, as conscious beings, we fit in to the universe. So, I think this is important. I mean, it doesn't mean everyone has to work on it. It doesn't, if you want to do neuroscience and, you're not interested in what's sometimes called the hard problem of consciousness, that's fine, right? It's not everyone has to do this. And, there's very important work you can do without, very important empirical work you can do without worrying about, these philosophical questions of consciousness. But And if you just want to say, I'm agnostic, I don't know what the truth is, I'm not, that's not what interests me, that's absolutely fine. But I think it is natural, noble human curiosity to want to know, to want to be curious about what is going on in reality and try and have our best guess about what the answer is.
Oh, I so agree. I think it's one of the things that we sometimes in modern society have grown maybe a little bit lazy, or we've been privileged to be able to um, forget or become distracted from these basic fundamental questions. Like very often, you'll meet people that say, "Oh, I'm not very political," and I'm always like, "Oh, that's such a privileged position to be in." Like you have to be political if you are in a group that has been disenfranchised, right? Like it's fundamental to your freedom and your safety to be political. And so it's a privilege to not be political. And I think in some ways it's a privilege to not think philosophically or to not think scientifically about these kinds of questions. And again, like you just said, I want to reiterate that not everybody has to dedicate their lives to these things. That's why we're so grateful for people like you and for people like Sean Carroll and for people like X, Y, and Z, because you guys have dedicated your lives and your academic career so that we get to read the fruits of your labor. But to never even think about these things, to me, is so um bleak. Like I would feel impoverished mentally if I didn't sometimes just question these things. It doesn't mean I have to know the answer, but I like to be as informed as possible. I have no idea if I agree with panpsychism or not. I want to dig deeper into it, but I'm glad to know that there are all of these problems that have been worked out or are being actively worked on, so that when I have a little idea, a little kind of light bulb going off in my head, I don't have to feel like I'm alone in the world and like I'm the first person to ever think about this. I can go and I can find other writers and other thinkers and other philosophers who have developed these ideas in a kind of thoroughly fleshed out way so that I can start to piece together my own worldview. Because ultimately, isn't that what it's about, right? We're all kind of floating around, interacting with each other. We have this relational intersubjectivity, and we just want to have a very rich understanding of our place in the universe.
Yeah, it's a common endeavor, isn't it? And the empirical science have their very important role to play. That I think philosophers have a role to play. And I mean, I think part of the problem actually, and is attacking my own profession now, is philosophers don't reach out enough. Everything is so specialized these days. And, if you try and read an academic article in philosophy and you don't have a PhD, you're going to struggle to understand it. Philosophers don't try and communicate to a broader audience. And so, this is part of the reason I've written an academic book a few years ago called Consciousness and Fundamental Reality, aimed at an academic audience. But I wanted to write this book, Galileo's Error, just trying to communicate in as accessible a way as possible these ideas that I think are important and people are interested in. Just to come back to the politics thing, I just wanted to. I mean, just what's really annoying me in the UK at the moment with coronavirus is some people saying we've got to take the politics out of it, and what they mean by that is you can't criticize the government's approach. And I think, the UK government's approach has been disastrous in many ways. We've just slow and we're going to have tens of thousands of deaths. I'm afraid. I mean, I hope not, but I worry because of that. And people saying, take the politics out of it means you can't hold the government to account. It's the same with our National Health Service here. There's always often a call to take the politics out of it. But, it's a political matter because our current government, in their hearts, want to get rid of it, want to privatize the National Health Service. So we've got to have we can't get rid of these questions, just like you can't get rid of philosophical questions. The logical positivists tried, and unfortunately, they don't go away. They just keep you awake at night.
Absolutely. At least they keep me awake at night. And I think that's probably the case for a lot of people listening to this show. I think in some ways that is the appeal of Talk Nerdy and of kind of all the different crossover between this show and others that people listen to is that it promotes thinking, and thinking is good. This is something that fundamentally feels good to be. I mean, it's hard and it can be a little bit painful, but on the other end of that pain is meaning. And it's easy to say, and I think we often find ourselves in a very cynical place to say not enough people think anymore. And I know that that's not true. I think fundamentally we are thinking more than we ever did in the past, but there is a privilege. Again, I come back to that, to not having to do the work because of the kind of things that our parents and grandparents and grandparents have brought to us. They've brought us a lot of other difficulties that we have to work ourselves out of.
Yeah.
But the privilege to be a more educated and more literate society is definitely a net positive. So,
I mean, also
I guess.
sorry, just apart from anything else, the critical thinking skills you get in a philosophy degree are important. Living in a democracy, seeing through the bullshit of politicians' arguments and the logical fallacies they make. Being able to rigorously tear apart, rigorously analyze somebody's argument. I mean, even if you don't got. Most people who do a philosophy degree don't go on to do philosophy, but those skills, I think, of understanding arguments and being able to rigorously assess them, I think is a really important skill in a democracy. And so I think that's.
Oh, I completely agree. I mean, even at the undergrad level, which that's kind of where my philosophy training stopped, although I think it's coming back in at the PhD level because I'm more interested in a philosophically, theoretically grounded approach to psychotherapy. But even as it was my minor in undergrad, that armed me with some of the most fundamental critical thinking skills that have allowed me to kind of develop as a skeptical thinker. Without that kind of training, I don't know where I'd be. And also, I think a lot of people forget that if you're getting a PhD in any field, that's a doctorate of philosophy. and at the very beginning, at least, that's what there was meaning to that. You should have to be able to think philosophically about your physics or about your environmental science or whatever the case may be.
Yes, I mean, part of what this book was a defense of philosophy as well. I spent some time, justifying this idea that philosophy has a role to play.
Such an important one as well. Well, Philip, I'm sure there are things we didn't cover. If there's anything really striking that you think of in the next few minutes, let's make sure that we do. But I wanted to let you know that I close every episode of Talk Nerdy the same way. I ask my guests these two basic kind of big picture questions because I'm always so interested to see how each of my individual guests, based on their work, based on their life's journeys, kind of conceptualize these things. So I was hoping that you'd be willing to take a crack at them.
Sure, why not?
All right. So I want you to think about the future in whatever context is relevant to you today. That could be informed by what's going on in the world, could be informed by your work, by your personal life, whatever the case may be. And I want you to tell me, number one, what is the thing that keeps you up the most at night? The thing that you're maybe a little bit pessimistic, even borderline cynical about, like your true fundamental worry. And then on the flip side of that, what are you genuinely, kind of authentically looking forward to, optimistic about? Not just lip service, but like truly have a positive outlook on.
Wow. I suppose on the negative side, I'm a politics nerd, and politics worries me, I suppose. I mean, I guess my political philosophy is basically that my lifetime was when it all went crap. I'm 41 now, and so my philosophy of recent history is the 30 years after the war after the Second World War in the US, the UK, and much of Western Europe, we did it right. Right, we worked out how to have a properly mixed economy, high taxation, high regulation. And, society got more prosperous, society got more equal. the baby boomer generation is the luckiest that ever lived. And then from the 80s onwards, we decided on Wild West capitalism. We cut taxes, we cut regulation, and we've had crisis after crisis. We've had 2008 when the bankers brought the world to their knees, and ordinary people have been paying the price for the last 10 years. So I think, we've seen these two options. We've tried out both options. And I think recent history tells us which one works. And some people think but when you had these high levels of taxation, that people didn't pay them. But actually, there's been a recent empirical study by two economists at Berkeley, can't remember the names now, that the wealthy did pay much more tax. They paid on average 50% of their income, their entire income. Whereas now in the States, this is, by the way, it's around 23%. So,
it's tiny.
But what really, I thought 2008, wow, everything's going to change now. Everything's going to change. This has been systematically proved that this market fundamentalism, this neoliberalist approach doesn't work. And I was just flabbergasted. Is that a US word as well as a UK word? I was blown away by that our government in the UK persuaded everyone that it was just a fault of the last Labour government spending too much money. And then we had 10 years of harsh public sector cuts that have resulted in tens of thousands of lost lives. And I mean, that's what's really, really politicized me, is just, and I'm, so I guess it's made me pessimistic. And we're now in this new crisis that is, we're going to end up much more indebted than 2008. Our government here are paying, rightly, I think, 80% of wages of anyone in the country who can't work. Are we going to spend 50 years of austerity, 50 years of public sector pay cuts? And anyway, so that's what worries me.
I'm with you on that, I have to say.
What I'm optimistic about, I suppose, is my work on is not my work on is what I'm optimistic about is how things are changing on consciousness, on the philosophy and science of consciousness. I think things have changed so quickly. We've gone from, for much of the 20th century, consciousness was a taboo topic that it wasn't thought of as proper subject matter for serious science. Perhaps the height of this was the behaviorists, who thought the only proper focus for science of mind was behavior that you can measure and quantify. I think from towards the end of the 20th century, the 1990s, we do start to get people taking the problem of consciousness as a serious scientific issue. It came to be okay to be working on consciousness. And I think things are changing so quickly. I mean, but I think still, though, the approach of many is to say, there is a problem. We just need to do more neuroscience and we'll solve it. So, what I try to press is, as I said, this isn't just another scientific problem. This, in many ways, our conventional scientific approach wasn't designed for this problem. And I think that really, people really are starting to come to this view now. We're starting to see scientists and philosophers coming together to make progress on this issue, and start to see that we really need to, not that we can't have a science of consciousness, but if we want a science of consciousness, we need to really rethink what science is. And I think, it's really exciting how much is changing quickly, and I'm really optimistic about the future. And I think it offers hope, not just that we can resolve this very deep challenge for contemporary science, but also I think that it can transform in a positive way our understanding of what it means to be a human being and what it means to live in this universe. And so I'm very hopeful about the area I work in, and I'm very pessimistic about everything else.
I love it.
but you've got to live in hope. And I like, who's the line? I can't remember who said this now. Pessimism of the intellect, but optimism of the will. And that's what I try to live by. You've got to have hope, and you've got to keep fighting. And Yeah.
I think that's probably the party line of like every scientist and philosopher out there. I love that so much. Well, gosh, Philip, this has been an absolute joy. Everybody, the book is Galileo's Error: Foundations for a New Science of Consciousness. Philip, thank you so much. I've learned so much today.
Oh, thank you, Cara. I've really enjoyed the conversation, and I'm going to explore existentialist psychotherapy. But
I love it. Yes,
what is the
please
word again?
do.
What is the title again? It wasn't
Yeah,
quite that.
that
Existentialist.
works.
Yeah,
Existential psychology,
yeah. That sounds
existential
really,
psychotherapy.
really
Check
fascinating to
out
me.
Irvin Yalom. He's
Irvin Yalom.
amazing.
Okay,
Yeah, he's
I will
great.
do.
And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.